read on Thursday, and unwalled towns on Friday. For it is written, in each and every year, which teaches that just as each and every year unwalled towns read the Megillah on the 14th of Adar, and furthermore, the time for this, walled cities, is unlike the time for this, unwalled towns, i.e. walled and unwalled cities read on separate dates. So here too, when the 14th falls on a Friday, unwalled towns must read on the 14th, and the time for this, walled cities, must be unlike the time for this, unwalled towns. To reconcile both of these rules, walled cities must be shifted to Thursday so as not to read on the same day as the unwalled towns, which retain their regular date, the 14th, Friday.
Okay. So this is the unpacking of what is the thought process of the first unnamed sage. And the assumption that the Gemara gives this person is that according to the way we understand it, there always has to be a difference between walled cities and unwalled cities. They shouldn't be reading on the same day. Usually, that means that the walled cities read a day later, a day after everybody else. But that's just happenstance. The main point is that we want to differentiate between walled cities and unwalled cities. So then, if they can't read a day after, then let them read a day before. So therefore, let's take the walled cities, put them on Thursday, and let the unwalled cities read, as always, on the 14th. Now the Gemara is going to challenge this. Go ahead.
Okay. The Gemara notes that different lesson can be derived from the same verse in each and every year, which contradicts the Tanna Kamma's ruling. But say that verse in each and every year teaches the following. Just as each and every year walled cities do not precede unwalled towns, so here too, when the 14th falls on a Friday, walled cities must not precede unwalled towns. How can the Tanna Kamma rule that in this case walled cities read on Thursday prior to unwalled towns which read on Friday?
Right. So basically what they're saying is, what about Rabbi Yossi's argument? Doesn't Rabbi Yossi's argument a good argument? Let's understand that the structure that the Megillah insists on is not that simply they always have to be on a different day, but they can't be before the bulk of the population. The walled cities have to wait until the main population reads the Megillah, and then the walled cities come afterwards. Maybe that's what it is, that they simply cannot precede them. In which case, putting the walled cities reading on Thursday would be a complete violation of what the main point is. How do you know that that's not what the main principle is? Gemara answers.
Here it is different because it is not possible to avoid having the walled cities precede the unwalled towns. Since unwalled towns must always read on the 14th, and walled cities cannot read on the same date as unwalled towns, there is no alternative but for walled cities to precede the unwalled towns and read on Thursday.
Okay, so in other words, what the Gemara is now saying is, and this is the same thing we had it before, 4 words. Shani hacha de lo efshar. Here it's different because it's impossible. It's not possible to abide by the usual structure that exists on most years. So why is it not possible? It's not possible, and here's where we get the true underlying assumption. The assumption is that if we can at all possibly have the unwalled cities read on the 14th, we will never give that up. It's only when we can't have them read on the 14th that we have adjustments that we make. But that's our first priority. So number 1, our first priority is unwalled cities must read on the 14th. Then what do we do with the walled cities? Well, if they can read on the 15th, great. If they can't read on the 15th, they can't read on the 14th. because they have to be on a different day than the walled cities. And we've already reserved the 14th for the unwalled cities. Therefore, the walled cities have to then be pushed up to a different day. What will that be? That'll be Thursday instead of Friday. So that's the anonymous opinion. But Rabbi Yossi rejects that. Go ahead.
The Gemara gives the reason for Rabbi Yossi's opinion. What is Rabbi Yossi's reason for ruling that when walled cities cannot read on the 15th, for it is the Sabbath, both unwalled towns and walled cities read on Friday the 14th? For it is written, in each and every year, which teaches that just as each and every year walled cities do not precede unwalled towns in the reading of the Megillah, so here too, walled cities do not precede unwalled towns in the reading of the Megillah. Therefore, for walled cities to read on the 13th and unwalled towns on the 14th is not an option. Rather, both walled and unwalled cities must read on the 14th.
Okay, so now what we have is Rabbi Yossi saying, as he said before, that no, my main consideration in allotting times for these different communities is that the walled cities cannot come first, period. Usually that means that they're going to come second, but they certainly can't come first. So therefore, he says, Rabbi Yossi, if we are precluded from having the walled cities follow the unwalled cities by a day because it's Shabbat, then when are the unwalled cities reading? The unwalled are they're reading on the 14th because that's always our priority day for the unwalled cities. They're going to read on the 14th. So where do the unwalled cities go? The answer is let them also read on the 14th, as long as they're not sticking out as being prior to the unwalled cities. That's good enough for me. So in that exceptional situation, when Purim falls out on Shabbos, when the 15th falls out on Shabbos, in that exceptional situation, the walled cities will join with the rest of the community and read the Megillah on the 14th. Okay, so this is his argument. And now the Gemara is going to flip it around again and start using the argument from the anonymous sage, saying, hey, Rabbi Yossi, why don't you accept this other argument? Go ahead.
The Gemara notes that a different lesson can be derived from the same verse in each and every year, which contradicts Rabbi Yossi's ruling. But say that the verse in each and every year teaches the following. Just as each and every year the time for this walled cities is unlike the time for this unwalled cities, i.e., walled and unwalled cities read on separate dates. So here too, when the 14th falls on a Friday, the time for this, unwalled cities, must be unlike the time for this, unwalled towns. How can Rabbi Yossi rule, therefore, that both walled and unwalled cities read on the same day, Friday?
Okay, the word unwalled cities is in the brackets is incorrect. It should be walled cities.
Okay, maybe that's why I'm even more confused.
Right. Well, you should be. You're entitled to be. Good, because this has a lot of moving parts to it. Okay, so now what we have is we have the Gemara throw to Rabbi Yossi. Why don't you agree with the Tanna Kama? The Tanna Kama thought through this whole business. And the Tanna Kama is suggesting, the Tanna Kama, means the first sage, who's not mentioned by name, is suggesting that, look, when we have in regular years, we have the basic reading is on the 14th for all the unwalled cities and so on. And the walled cities read on a different day. The Megillah goes out of its way to say, no, let the walled cities read on a different day. So isn't that really what the message is, that we need to have two separate days for the walled cities and the unwalled cities? Isn't that the priority that the Megillah has taught us to preserve? So we don't want to squish them all on the same day. If we wanted to squish them all on the same day, then the Megillah could have mandated from the beginning, everybody read on the 14th, period. But the Megillah went out of its way to say, no, walled cities have to read on a different day. So that seems to require that the walled cities cannot be included on the 14th with the other with the rest of the community. So when they can't read on the 15th because it's Shabbos, so what are we going to do with those walled cities? The answer is we have to find their own special day. The walled cities must have their own special day, and that special day, one second, and that special day is therefore the day before. So now let me see what you wrote, because I didn't catch it. Let me see where it is. Is the difference of a day about the extra time needed for the news to travel into a walled city? No, it has nothing to do with that. That's a different consideration. That's the consideration that we have in terms of deciding when Rosh Chodesh is and stuff like this. Everybody knows what the dates are. In this case, because we're in the middle of the month already. So Rosh Chodesh has been determined. Even if there was some kind of question about the news traveling for when is the first day of the month, that's having to do with whether we have 1 day of Yom Tov or 2 days of Yom Tov and so on. That's what David is bringing up. That's not the issue here at all. By the time we get to the middle of the month, everybody knows that today is the 14th, tomorrow is the 15th, and the only question is, so which day are we reading? If Shabbat is the 15th, we can't read on Shabbat. So what day are we supposed to read? That's the trigger for all of these different kinds of questions. So the Gemara says now to Rabbi Yossi, why don't you accept that as the primary concern for the Megillah? Gemara answers,
here it is different, because it's not possible to avoid having walled and unwalled cities read on the same date. Since, as mentioned above, walled cities cannot precede unwalled towns, and unwalled towns cannot be shifted from the 14th, there is no alternative but for both walled towns and unwalled cities to share the same date, the 14th.
Okay. So this now is the same 4-word answer. Shani hacha lo efshar. This is different here because it's not possible to make the differentiations. So what Rabbi Yossi is saying is, I just do not buy what you're saying. My juggling of these competing concerns is a different juggling. What I'm saying is that the primary value is never move the main community from the 14th if you can help it. And then my next value is that the walled cities cannot precede the unwalled cities in the reading. Usually that means they come after. But if we can't have them come after, then let them join the walled cities. Let them join the unwalled cities on the 14th. Let them read on the same day. I'm ready to compromise on the differentiation part for the sake of not making the walled cities read first. Okay, according to Rabbi Yossi, that's Rabbi Yossi. And according to the Tanakama, the anonymous sage, I'm willing to compromise on the date of reading for the walled cities and make them read actually before the unwalled cities, even though that's usually absolutely never happens. But I'm willing to let that happen here to maintain the differentiation of dating between walled cities and unwalled cities. So everybody agrees that the unwalled cities should stay where they are on the 14th. But then the question is, how much do we juggle the walled cities? This is a little bit different than what we had before. What we had before was that we were willing to push the unwalled cities to the day of market day in order to maintain an order of unwalled cities first and then walled cities second. So we have here a number of different kinds of jugglings that are going about, because we have multiple considerations that we would love to preserve as we understand the regular kind of system. But then when there's a glitch in the system, the question is, what do we save and what do we sacrifice? Where do we compromise and where do we put our foot down? And in each of these statements, we've got numerous ones. Each one is taking the same elements, but then reconfiguring them by giving weight to one element over another element. And how do you decide which element gets more weight than the other? The answer is because. Because that's what I said, right? And each of these views disagrees with the other view because that's the way it has to be here. It's impossible to have our cake and eat it too. So therefore, we're going to compromise. And here's the compromise that I'm suggesting. Here's what I'm holding on to. Here's what I'm giving up on. Okay, that's what we have here again and again. Okay, we're moving right along.
In the first
one more question. Wait, David has another question. He typed it in. Do we know why? 1 second. Now I have to read it from the chat again. Do we know why on day 1 Shushan observed in a day? Do we know why on day 1 Shushan observed in a day after the whole of Persia? Yes, the answer is because the fighting in Shushan continued for an extra day. So the celebration was pushed off by one more day because the celebration was after the fighting was over. In the rest of Persia, the fighting ended on the 14th, and in Shushan itself, the fighting continued until the 15th. So the celebration was always after the fighting was over. Okay. Now we have a little break here, and now in the first Braita. Go ahead, Beryl.
In the first Baraita quoted above, Rabbi ruled that unwalled towns are not shifted to the preceding day of assembly, Thursday, but retain their regular date, Friday. The Gemara now cites a Baraita in which Rabbi seems to give a variant ruling. And does Rabbi really hold that unwalled towns are not shifted to the day of assembly? But it was taught in a Baraita, if the 14th of Adar falls on a Sabbath, villages...
Right, this is different. Now let's understand, this is different than when the 15th fell on a Sabbath. This is the 14th is falling on a Sabbath. Go ahead.
Villages advance their reading to the day of assembly, Thursday, and large unwalled towns read on the eve of the Sabbath, Friday, and walled cities read the next day, Sunday. Rebbe says,
I
say that since the unwalled towns are shifted from their regular spot, the 14th, for it is Sabbath, they are shifted to the day of assembly, Thursday. In contrast to this position in earlier Baraita, here Rebbe rules that unwalled towns are indeed shifted to the preceding day of assembly.
Okay. So this question now, and we have a note, it seems that this is also contradictory to our Mishnah, gives us a whole different set of options, right? If the 14th, not the 15th, but if the 14th falls on Shabbat, there's no Megillah reading on the 14th. Then what do we do? So according to the first opinion, the villages go back 2 days. Right? The villages would read on Thursday. I would read on the 14th, but the 14th is Shabbat. So they can't read on Shabbat. When should they read? The answer is let them read on market day, which is 2 days back on Thursday. Right? These are the small villages, the small towns that have a problem finding a competent Megillah reader. So let them go back to Thursday. But what about the big towns that don't have a problem with finding a Megillah reader? Do they have to go back to the market day, to the Thursday, 2 days back? The answer is no. They only have to go back to Friday. So they end up reading, the villages read on the 12th, the big towns that don't have walls read on the 13th, and what about the walled cities? They read on the 15th as usual, which is Sunday. So now what we have is we have a gap of 2 days of Megillah reading, and then Shabbat, and then another day of Megillah reading. That's the Tanakama. That's the first opinion. And then Rebbe says, no. Let's not do that, right? Instead, since the unwalled towns are shifted from their regular spot, they can't read on Shabbat. Therefore, let them all go to Thursday, right? And no reading on Friday. Everybody now shares, everybody except the walled cities. The walled cities read on Sunday, the 15th, which is their regular day. And all the other people read on Thursday, the 12th. That's Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's opinion in this Braita. Okay, but according to that, it seems that what he is willing to do is to shift people, the people in the unwalled cities, he's shifting them. They could have read on Friday, and he's shifting them to the market day on Thursday. Before, we had him quoted saying, no, let's not shift them. Let them read on Friday. So now what's the difference between, is he contradicting himself? Very well, then let him contradict himself. Or is he just coming up with a different factor here? So the Gemara says there's a change here. There's a different factor that has to be brought in. Gemara explains. Gemara distinguishes.
The Gemara distinguishes between the two cases. Now, is this so? Can a comparison be made between the two Baraitas? There, in the case discussed in the second Baraita, the time for unwalled towns, i.e., the 14th, is a Sabbath, and since unwalled towns are anyway shifted from the Sabbath because the Megillah cannot be read on the Sabbath, they are shifted all the way to the day of assembly, Thursday. However, here, in the case of the first Baraita, the time for unwalled towns, i.e. the 14th, is the eve of the Sabbath, Friday, and therefore there is no need for them to be shifted at all.
Right. So that's now the distinction. The distinction is, look, once they can't read on the day that they're supposed to read, then all bets are off. Then we have to decide, so what day should they read? The answer then is, well, it's a priority. Let's get everybody together, and then everybody can hear the Megillah at the same time, and let them read on the day of assembly, which means the market day. So that satisfies our need to have everybody on the same page, literally. And the reason that we're going there is because the mandated day is not possible. But in the first Braita, that Braita was talking about the 15th being on Shabbat. And that caused us trouble with the walled cities. But the unwalled cities have no problem. The 14th is on Friday. So there's no reason to push them off from their regular day. That's the mandated day. So that's what Rebbe said. When you don't have to shift somebody, don't shift them. When you don't have to change the day from what the Megillah requires, then keep them on that day. So that's the first opinion of Rebbe. And the second opinion of Rebbe is, but when the required day is impossible because it's Shabbat, then we can make the readjustments that we need to make. And it's open, and therefore the preferable readjustment is to create one consolidated day for reading the Megillah for everybody, and that's going to be on the 13th, which is Thursday, the market day. So, again, what we have here is numerous permutations and possibilities because we have a couple of considerations, right? We have the consideration of, first of all, we have 3 different populations. We don't have 2, we have 3. Sometimes we conflate them into 2, and sometimes even into 1, but we start out with 3, right? The 3 populations are the walled cities. The walled cities read on the 15th, according to the Megillah, according to the original plan. Then we've got everybody that's not a walled city. So that's the whole population. That's most people. They read on the 14th, the day of Purim. That's the regular day of Purim. But then we had the Gemara, or the Mishnah actually, recognize that there's a third group. The third group is the peasantry, right? The people who don't have the same wherewithal to read Megillah on the 14th as we originally would like. So what we do for them is we say, look, we want to be good to you. We want to make it possible for you to hear Megillah. Therefore, go on the market day, right? That's how our Mishnah first started. So our Mishnah created a 3-segment community instead of the original 2-segment community. And then the question is, okay, now how do we juggle those 3 segments when our regular schedule doesn't happen? When our regular schedule happens, you've got the 15th for the walled cities, you've got the 14th for the big towns and places where people can read Megillah without any problem. That's on the 14th. And then the farming communities that don't have that kind of talent or pool, they read on some other day, on the market day. That's when normal times. Now the Gemara the Mishnah brings up, but wait a second, what if the regular reading of the Megillah is precluded because of Shabbat? Then how do we shuffle things around? And that's what our last whole page of Gemara has been doing, is sorting out all of the possibilities. Do we put the unwalled cities with the walled cities? Do we put the unwalled cities with the farm people? Do we put the walled cities with the unwalled cities, or do we keep them differentiated? Do we allow them to have a separate day even if it's before the other day? Or do we keep the 14th as a main day no matter what, and then everybody else has to scramble around it? Do we want to consolidate groups of people to make sure that the reading of the Megillah happens with most people at the same time? Or do we want to cater to the separate communities' needs and also to our own sense of differentiating between them? So these are conflicting considerations. And what we have seen is we have our Mishnah, which gives us one approach. And then we have, in the extra traditions not included in the Mishnah, we have more scenarios imagined and more opinions offered. And then the question is, can we harmonize them? Can we allot the Mishnah's anonymous opinion to somebody that we can identify? And then we still have to understand that whatever opinion is in the Mishnah is not everybody's opinion. Even though it sounds like it's a consensus opinion, that's the power of the Mishnah. The power of the Mishnah is it is the strongest voice. And whenever it doesn't record a conflict, we're assuming everybody agrees with what the Mishnah says. What the Talmud does is it reopens up the complexity. And it says, you know what? Just because the Mishnah says this as a blanket statement doesn't mean that everybody agreed. We have plenty of records to show that not everybody agreed. And therefore, the question is, well, then who does the Mishnah represent? Whose opinion does the Mishnah actually seek to officially record? But we know that there are other opinions. In this sense, the Mishnah, the authority of the Mishnah is a little bit weakened, right? Because we're not just taking what the Mishnah says unquestioningly. What we're saying is the Mishnah may have chosen to edit or to be very selective about what information we should get, and decided to reject all the other opinions that were not included in the Mishnah. But we're not going to let the Mishnah do that. We are going to preserve these other traditions, even though the Mishnah didn't. And we're going to hold on to those other opinions and try to understand the competing arguments back and forth between them. What the Gemara does not do is the Gemara doesn't resolve the question. Whose opinion is the authoritative opinion? Is the Mishnah right? Is this just that we want to make sure that we remember all the other people, make sure that you show the footnotes correctly? Is that what it's all about? Or does that other opinion now merit serious consideration and we should follow that other opinion? The Gemara doesn't tell us. That's one of the steps that the subsequent tradition had to take. Choices had to be made. Okay, any questions up to this point? All right. So now we continue on 4b4. The Gemara seeks.
Gemara seeks to identify the source of the following Amoraic statement.
Right. Amoraic statement means an Amora said it. An Amora is a sage from the time of the Talmud. An Amora is a sage who lived after the Mishnah was put out, after the Mishnah was published. Sages that lived in the time of the Mishnah, whose opinions may or may not be recorded in the Mishnah, but who lived in that time, they are called a Tana. Single is Tana, plural is Tanaim. A statement by a Tana is a Tanaic or Tanaitic statement. Those statements can be found in the Mishnah or in the Braita. Usually the Braita is also from the time of the Mishnah. So then there too, we call it a Tanakama, the first Tana, the first teacher in the Braita. All of those people are living in the hundreds of years that the Mishnah took form. Once the Mishnah was codified in approximately 220 CE, 150 years after the temple was destroyed, all sages that came to their maturity, that came to their standing, and became recognized teachers after that time. I mean, they could have been kids at the time they could have been born in 200 CE, but if they didn't become recognized rabbis until after 220 CE, they are no longer a Tana, they are an Amora. And in our traditional understanding, they are secondary in authority to the rabbis who came before them. In order to argue with rabbis that came before them, they have to show that some other rabbi who came before them is on their side. They theoretically don't have the right to argue with what came before them. This was the understanding of the development of the tradition. There are many, many times where this gets modified or there are exceptions and so on, but this is the rule of thumb, and it's a very important rule of thumb. It makes the Gemara go to great lengths to figure out ways to modify things in the Mishnah, and they can't simply say, well, we don't agree with the Mishnah anymore, so we decided to do something differently. The Mishnah is the base authority from which everything else flows. Okay, so now we have an Amoraic statement. That means a statement that was said after the Mishnah was finished.
Whose opinion does the following statement made by Rav Chelbo in the name of Rav Huna follow? If Purim, the 14th of Adar, falls on a Sabbath, all locales are shifted to the day of assembly, Thursday. Before giving the source, the Gemara first clarifies the statement. Can it even enter your mind that literally all locales are shifted to the day of assembly, Thursday, when the 14th is a Sabbath? But there are the walled cities which read on the next day, Sunday, the 15th of Adar. Rather, this is what Rav Huna meant. Any locale that has to be shifted, i.e. the unwalled locales, is shifted to the day of assembly, Thursday.
Okay, so the Gemara has this statement by a later sage who's quoting an earlier later sage, right? Rav Chelbo comes after Rav Huna. Rav Huna comes after the Mishnah. And Rav Chelbo said, my teacher Rav Huna taught that once we're pushing things off, everybody gets pushed off. If Shabbos is the day of Purim, we can't read on Shabbos. Therefore, we're pushing everything not to Friday, but to Thursday. Okay, once we push it off, we push it to the day of assembly, to the market day, which is Thursday. So the Gemara says, is that really so? Does everybody gets pushed off? If Shabbos is the 14th, then Sunday is the 15th. That means that the walled cities are able to read on the 15th. Are we really, just because the 14th is pushed off, because we can't read on the 14th, then that means that everybody gets pushed off to the previous market day? That's the way it sounds. So here we have the possibility of a completely different point of view. And that this point of view would say all of our assumptions about who reads when are based on first getting the 14th solidified. If the 14th is Purim, then we can start worrying about who's going to read before the 14th and who's going to read after the 14th. But if we cancel out the 14th, then all bets are off, and that means that walled cities are also not going to be on a different day. If there is no 14th, then there's no nothing, and then we have to find out, okay, what do we substitute for the 14th? And the best substitute is get everybody in the market day, because that's when everybody's around, and let's do our Megillah reading on the market day. So let everybody do it on the market day, since the 14th itself has been canceled. That's one way of reading what Rav Chelbo's report of Rav Huna is. But the Gemara throws that out immediately. They say, are you kidding? Could anybody think that way? Nobody could think that way. If the 15th is still an eligible day for Megillah reading for the walled cities, then of course we're going to maintain the 15th for the walled cities. So then the only question is, what do we do with everybody else? And that's what Rav Huna said. What we do for everybody else is we move everybody not to Friday, but to Thursday. We move everybody to the market day. Okay, once we understand Rav Huna to be saying that and not to be giving a completely new opinion, which would be shocking since it's not recorded in any of the Tanaim, now the question is, so who is Rav Huna voting for? Whose opinion has Rav Huna adopted from those Tanaim, those sages that lived in the generation before him? Who is he finally paskening, like, as we say in yeshiva English, right? Who is he finally choosing to follow? So now the Gemara answers.
The Gemara now gives the source of Rav Huna's statement. Whom does this statement of Rav Huna follow? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi recorded in Baraita above.
Okay, so that says that if we have the various arguments that we recorded beforehand, we can now line up, once we take out that radical possibility of understanding Rav Huna as a new opinion. If we say that no, Rav Huna's opinion must line up with what we've had before, it turns out that Rav Huna's opinion lines up with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. It lines up with what Rabbi had said earlier, which we said before, what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi also said. Look, if we're pushing people up, then we're going to push them up to the market day. So that's that. Now let's look, though, at note 21.
Why did the Gemara not simply say that Rav Huna follows our Mishnah, which rules that if the 14th falls on a Sabbath, both villages and unwalled towns read on the day of assembly, Thursday?
Right. So why say it's Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi? Why not simply say it that Rav Huna is following our Mishnah? Right? This would align Rav Huna with what we always feel most comfortable about, when the Mishnah is not challenged but confirmed. So this would make us feel better. Why don't we say that? Go ahead.
Ritva and Maharja answer that the Gemara prefers to attribute Rav Huna's statement to Rebbe, a specific Tana, rather than to Mishnah, which is recorded anonymously.
Okay.
Ritva.
So the answer is that the Mishnah is too vague. right? We had a whole problem. Who is the Mishnah actually following, or whose opinion is recorded in the Mishnah? Is it Rabbi Yossi? It could be Rabbi Yossi. Is it Rabbi? It could be Rebbe. So the saying that it follows the Mishnah is not so informative. Now we actually pin it down to being Rebbe. Okay. So let's skip the parentheses. Now Rav Huna.
Rav Huna's statement is not an absolute rule that whenever a locale's date is shifted, it is automatically shifted to the day of assembly. For the Gemara has concluded that it follows Rebbe's opinion, and as recorded in the Baraita quoted above, Rebbe rules that if the 15th of Adar falls on a Sabbath, walled cities are shifted not to Thursday, the preceding day of assembly, but to Friday. Rather, Rav Huna's rule applies only in this particular case when the 14th falls on a Sabbath.
Okay, so what we have here in this note is again a kind of a pulling back from the implications that were possible in understanding Rav Huna. It would have been possible to understand Rav Huna as a freestanding opinion with its own variations on these permutations of adjustments. But the Gemara doesn't want to make Rav Huna, who is a later sage, or not the Gemara, later commentators, including our footnote, don't want to make Rav Huna into a freestanding opinion. Therefore, all the opinions that we have recorded from the Tanaim have limited the other possibilities that we could have applied to understanding Rav Huna. We could have understood Rav Huna as making a big blanket statement that says once the 14th is knocked out of commission, then we simply go to the market day, right? And we don't have any of our other considerations to deal with. Yeah, go ahead. Let's see what you come up with. That's the thing. Shabbat for sure. Shabbat is the starting point. Shabbat is what's causing all the trouble here, right? Because we're not reading the Megillah on Shabbat. We're going to get to talking about Shabbat in another half a second. That's an exaggeration. It'll take us a little bit of time, but we could have understood Rav Huna as saying this very overarching simplification. Let's clear away all of these different details. Let's keep it all simple. Simply, as soon as the system doesn't work in its usual way, let's go to market day. But that's not the way we understand Rav Huna, because if we understood it that way, we would be inventing a new position that wasn't recorded previously. Therefore, we want to reinterpret what Rav Huna said in order to make him fit with the already known possibilities. So therefore, we have to go and do two modifications. First of all, we say he's really Rebbe. He's not throwing away the baby with the bathwater and saying, okay, everybody goes to the market day. He really agrees with Rebbe, number one. That means the walled cities will read on the 15th as always. And then only when the 14th is on Shabbat will everybody else be moved to the market day. But he also, his language seems to say that once we move somebody, then we move them to the market day, which could then be understood. What about the walled cities? What happens if Shabbat is the 15th, not the 14th? And then the only ones who are getting moved are the walled cities. The walled cities can't read on Shabbat for sure. So then what about Rav Huna's rule? If you're moving a group, move them not to the day before, but move them to the market day. Don't move them to Friday, move them to Thursday. What about that? The answer is no. We don't want to make Rav Huna saying that statement, because then it wouldn't be comporting with what Rebbe said. Once we've identified Rav Huna with Rebbe, we don't want him arguing with Rebbe some more, and therefore we squeeze the language of Rav Huna into the known opinions that we have before. And we say when Rav Huna said that, the students who heard him say that, the context was he was only talking about Shabbos preempting the 14th. He wasn't talking about Shabbos preempting the 15th. He was talking about the students come and said, well, what should we do? What should we do with everybody now that we can't read on the 14th? He says, everybody goes to the market day. But he didn't mean it as everybody, what about some other situation? No, he was simply answering a question about this specific situation. So these are some of the ways that we take a methodological approach to understanding statements, even though the statement could have been understood legitimately in a different way. But because we want to keep a certain sense of propriety of sages when they argue and when they don't argue with each other, we don't take the statement that the sage said at face value, and we have to reinterpret what they said. We have to contextualize what they said differently in order to preserve the hierarchy that we believe in. Okay, so that's the working out of all of these permutations. And now we get back to the very basic question. What's the deal with Shabbos? Shabbos has been causing us all of these troubles, that we're not reading the Megillah on Shabbos. What's that all about? So the last line on 4b4.
The Gemara seeks the reason for the prohibition against reading the Megillah on Sabbath.
Now let's remember, do we read Torah on Shabbos? Of course. That's one of the central parts of a Shabbat service, is that we read Torah. So what's the problem with reading the Megillah? Why can't we read the Megillah on Shabbos? Reading scripture, learning Torah? I mean, one way or the other. How come we don't read Megillah on Shabbos? We've been taking it for granted. I've been saying it so many times that it sort of sinks in as obvious. But now the Gemara says, wait a second. Why not read Megillah on Shabbos? Why should it be any different than reading the Torah? Go ahead.
At any rate, all the Tanaim mentioned above agree that we do not read the Megillah on the Sabbath. What is the reason for this restriction?
Okay, so the Gemara also says, and this is a consensus, this is not troubling to anybody. This is not controversial. There is no minority opinion or some other opinion that hasn't been recorded in the Mishnah. Everybody is working with the same basic assumption. Everybody knows that this is a no-no. So where is this coming from? How did this happen? The Gemara answers.
The Gemara answers, Rabbi said, everyone is obligated in the Megillah reading and in shofar blowing.
That's in parentheses. Right?
But,
in other words, not every text has that phrase in it. Some texts in the Gemara do not have those words in the Gemara. Okay? We'll get to that later. Go ahead.
But not everyone is competent in Megillah reading. Therefore, the rabbis ruled that the Megillah is not read on the Sabbath. As a precautionary decree, lest one take a Megillah in one's hands and go to an expert to learn how to read the Megillah, and thereby carry it 4 amos in a Reshush Harabim.
Reshut, in our modern Israeli pronunciation, Reshut Harabim.
Of biblical violation.
Okay, let's just continue this for a second.
The Gemara notes.
Yeah, the Gemara notes.
The Gemara notes that this reason applies in other cases as well. And this is the reason why we do not blow the shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on the Sabbath. And this is the reason why we do not hold the lulav when Sukkot falls on the Sabbath. The rabbis were concerned that lest one carry the shofar or lulav 4 amos in a reshut harabim and thereby commit a biblical violation.
Okay, so this is now a statement that applies to a number of mitzvot, and it starts in our discussion, our context with Megillah. And then the Gemara says, and this concern actually applies to a number of other situations as well. it applies, for instance, to shofar, not just to Megillah. That's why the shofar phrase is in parentheses. Because if it were not in parentheses, if it was really part of Rabbah's statement, then the Gemara wouldn't have to say, and this applies also to shofar. Right? If Rabbah said, everyone has to read Megillah, and everybody has to have the shofar blown, and we don't do this on Shabbos, then the Gemara afterwards wouldn't say, oh, and this is the same thing for shofar blowing. He said shofar blowing, didn't he? So that's why we take it out. Apparently some texts had it, and then other people, by mistake, and other people said, no, take it out, because we see from the Gemara that they didn't have it in the original statement. The original statement doesn't mention it, even though it applies to all those other situations. So now let's get back to understanding what exactly is being said. So Rabbah says that the reasoning is as follows. Even though we're obligated to read the Megillah, but as we already acknowledged again and again and again through all of these previous pages, we know in reality, not everybody knows how to read Megillah. And that's why we had to make the possibility of them going to the market day in order to have somebody read the Megillah for them and so on. So not everybody knows how to read Megillah. But everybody wants to read Megillah. That's the missing assumption that's very important here. Everybody wants to have the Megillah reading done, but not everybody can do it right. So therefore, what are we worried about? We're worried not everyone is competent in Megillah reading, and therefore we're worried that perhaps somebody will take their Megillah and go to somebody who knows how to read Megillah on Purim and say, here, please read Megillah for me, or teach me how to read the Megillah. I have my own Megillah. It's beautiful. I bought it in Jerusalem when I was on the last trip that I went to, and I want to read the Megillah, so please show me how to do it. And in their enthusiasm and their desire to fulfill the mitzvah of reading Megillah, they'll violate Shabbos. How will they violate Shabbos? They'll violate Shabbos because they will carry the Megillah in Reshut HaRabim. Reshut HaRabim means the public domain. So theoretically speaking, there are all kinds of laws of Shabbat, and you're not allowed to cook, and you're not allowed to write, you're not allowed to build things. But one of the things that you're not allowed to do is transfer objects from one realm to another. You're not allowed to move things. This is what's like interstate commerce. This is the basis for commerce. You're not allowed to move things around from one place that they've been to another place. And that means not just from my house to your house, but from, if it's in the public domain, that's nobody's house, you're not allowed to move it 6 feet. So you're not allowed to transfer something from its location 4 amot. 4 amot means 4 cubits. A cubit is 1.5 feet. That's the space that every individual occupies, according to halakha. And people have noticed this already for months now. Oh, isn't that the same thing as social distancing? That there's a 6-foot space that I occupy vis-a-vis your 6-foot space. We can't be in the same space together safely in these terrible times. So that's considered a domain in and of itself. 6 feet, of course, that's also, a grave. 6 feet is considered a definition of a personal space, even in the public. So moving something 6 feet in the public domain is considered a transgression of the Shabbat. So now if we take all of these legal details together, what we're saying is this is a sociological and psychological determination that the rabbis have made. What they're saying is there's an enthusiasm for Megillah, but the enthusiasm is not backed up by the literacy. And therefore, we're worried that people who are so devoted, they really want to keep the mitzvah of Megillah, but they're not going to be able to do it. They're going to inadvertently, or in their enthusiasm, they're not going to think about it, and they're going to transgress the Sabbath. in order to read the Megillah, and that we do not countenance. So the rabbis are saying we will preserve the Shabbat at the expense of reading the Megillah at its proper time. And therefore we change the time of reading Megillah from the 14th or from the 15th, depending on which group we're talking about. They're supposed to be reading on this day. No, we're not going to let them read the Megillah on this day because we're worried that it will lead to Sabbath violation. So this is the first level of what the sages have said. We're going to read some of the footnotes. I think, let's see if we're going to be able to handle some of this today. Yeah, I mean, basically, footnote 23. I gave you most of the discussion. I'm not going to go into that until next time because we have we have a little bit of time now, and we're going to go into this some more next week. But I want us to understand the basic message here. The basic message that the rabbis are conveying also is one of these we just had before. This kind of like really, I don't know how to characterize it, but a detailed. We have 5 different possibilities here. Which one do we juggle? Which one comes first? Which one comes second? With regard to reading the Megillah and the walled cities and the unwalled cities and the villages and Friday and Thursday and Sunday. So we have all these multiple possibilities, and then we have arguments about which possibility takes precedence over the other ones, which is the best choice. Now we have a parallel kind of situation where we have a lot of different concerns that we're juggling. And how do we decide which concern is paramount and which concern is secondary? And what we have here is not a controversial decision, but what we have here is a very straightforward consensus decision. When we have a question about whether you should read Megillah at its proper time or whether we should preserve Shabbat, the answer is we preserve Shabbat at all costs. This was the rabbinic situation. Now, let's understand, in general, reading Megillah on Shabbat is not a problem. If I am a competent Megillah reader, I can read Megillah on Shabbat the same way that I'm a competent Torah reader who can read the Torah on Shabbat. The rabbis actually mandated that we read Torah on Shabbat. They're not worried about carrying the Torah from one place to another, because their assessment of the realia of the society is that this is going to be a synagogue situation, and the synagogue is going to have a sacred scroll of the Torah, and people are going to know how to read, and we're going to have this as a community ritual, and that's going to be part of making the Shabbat a beautiful day, because there's no violations that we have to worry about. When it came to the more personal practice of reading a Megillah, which of course is also a lot easier to carry than a Torah, they were worried that, not that people wanted to violate Shabbat. They're not worried about, oh no, we have to worry about all this community that doesn't want to abide by the rules. One second. I apologize, my thing came out again, the plug. They're not worried that people are not respecting the Torah. They're not, on the contrary, they're worried about an upside down set of values, that the enthusiasm of the people for reading the Megillah will be so great that they won't be careful to do it in a way that will respect the Shabbat. So they went out on a limb here, and they said respecting the Shabbat comes first. And the sanctity of the Shabbat will be preserved by us to the detriment of the normal expectation of how to practice Purim. Okay, that's a very, very powerful message that that they enunciated here, and we're going to continue with this next time. But I will just plant the seed that this, for me, is a very important message to keep in mind during our own period of struggle, when we're trying to consider how do we keep our community together, how do we continue to have a strong Shomrei community, how do we use Judaism as an enriching element of people's lives, how do we maintain connections. All those are really important values. And then the question is, how much does Shabbos get compromised for the sake of those values? And at least as a starting point here, the message that I'm hearing from our sages is Shabbat, the sanctity of Shabbat overrules all of the wonderful, amazing, terrific benefits that would come from having this celebration of Purim with the whole community together at that time, if that celebration would entail a violation, the possibility, and that's what the point, the possibility of the violation of Shabbat. There's no guarantee that the Shabbat would be violated, but they're worried that if possibly this would lead to a violation of Shabbat, we're not going to do it. So we'll continue with this next time, and I look forward to seeing you. And I will also, God willing, remember, in fact, maybe I'll just do it right now when I get off. I will send everybody that I have in my emails the next PDF for page 5 of the Gemara. Okay? Be well, everybody. Thank you.
Be well. Thank you.